Welcome back to the Max Voltage YouTube channel, where we go through everything tech, crypto, and everything in between. Today, we're talking about the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. Maybe thinking, why is a crypto channel talking about the Consumer Price Index? We're going to go over that today. We're going to go over why it's important to crypto prices, and we're going to talk about 5 things that you didn't know about how and what the Consumer Price Index is all about and how it's calculated. All right, as Mining King would say, let's get right into it. So the first thing that people don't know about the CPI is that it doesn't just track price changes, it also tracks how our spending changes over time. Right now, the current calculation is about 1/3 of the entire calculation is on shelter. Shelter, which includes rent and owner equivalent rent, which we're going to go over that in number 2. But things such as gasoline, it's only 3%. A lot of people focus on that gasoline price, but it's only 3% of the entire Consumer Price Index. And food's only 14%. Medical care is about 7%. And all of this can change over time. Obviously, medical care costs go up. That will become a greater percentage of the Consumer Price Index. How does this change? These changes are made, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. That'll be in a future one. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. Now for number 2. Number 2 is all about OER, or owner equivalent rent. This is where the government, the people who do the CPI, measure how your owner equivalent rent, or people that own homes, how their costs change over time. Well, first off, it's 25% of the entire CPI, so it has a huge effect on the Consumer Price Index. But what boggles the mind, at least as far as I'm concerned, is how do we measure this? Let me make sure I get the quote right. The question that is asked in the survey by the government is, if you had to rent your home today, how much do you think it would cost? That's what they do in the survey. So that entire 25% is based upon the answers to that question. And I would bet, now maybe not my audience, but most people in this country own a home, have no idea what their market value is for their home. Especially the longer they own a home, the less they're going to actually know what their rent value is. So we're basing CPI on somebody's business sense as to how much they could rent their house for. That's just crazy. And we'll talk a little bit about how that was captured in previous years, way long ago. The other thing about OER, or owner equivalent rent, is that it lags the market. So it really takes a while for any type of change in that survey to actually show up in the Consumer Price Index. If you've heard in some of the news reports that the shelter number is sticky, meaning it's not going anywhere, this is the reason why. It's a lagging indicator. And for number 3, Consumer Price Index, the formula for it changes over time. Relating something that was back in, say, 1980 and the Consumer Price Index back then, you can't relate it to how we're reporting it today because the formula changed. Let's give some examples of how this formula changed between 1980 and today. So we were just talking about owner equivalent rents. Before 1983, that portion of the Consumer Price Index showing what the change in prices was for shelter of owning a home was done by home prices and mortgage rates. Makes sense to me, but for some reason back in 1983, they decided to change it to owner equivalent rent. I wonder why that is. If you remember back in the early 80s, inflation was pretty out of control, and this was a really easy way to artificially reduce the reporting number, which allowed interest rates to come down. In 1999, they made another change, which was geometric weighting. I know, sounds complicated title for basically just saying that the consumer price index takes into account when people change to cheaper alternatives. So instead of just focusing on the price of the same thing, if there's an alternative and people are changing to that, they will weight the CPI to take that into account. And then lastly, in 2023, I should say prior to 2023, they were changing the weights of everything in the consumer price index every 2 years. Starting in 2023, they're changing it every single year. So that's the reason why we had a change in 2024, and we just saw a change in 2025. And that last point actually deserves its own category. So for point number 4, the CPI does change the weights every single year. Like I said, just happened in January of this year. So let's take, for example, 2022, when gas prices were really high, that had a greater weight on the overall price index. In 2023, as gas prices came down and people were driving less, it had less of an impact on the consumer price index. Another key factor is as people decide to buy cheaper goods, it will also change the weight that these different goods would have on the CPI. It's a complicated formula, but I know some people like to look at the January adjustments as look at what the boogeyman's doing. No, it's based on overall spending, and the adjustments are really, really small. You have to really look at the scale of what people are reporting when they're saying, look, they changed the weighting on this to benefit them. No, as prices go up on something, especially if they go up a lot, people, again, supply and demand, people will buy it less if it gets more expensive. So yes, supply and demand has an effect on the CPI as well. If spending shifts towards cheaper goods, this might push the CPI index lower unexpectedly. On the other hand, if people spend more money on services, which are stickier in price, have a tendency to go up more than goods, this could have a negative effect on the CPI. It's all about this mix of how consumers spend money that has a very great effect on the overall consumer price index. And number 5, and this is the most important one of all, the CPI directly impacts, or indirectly, depending on how you want to look at it, affects crypto prices. Basically, your Bitcoin and your altcoin prices are affected by the CPI index. Why does it affect it? If the consumer price index is high, the Fed looks at it and says, that's not good, and will be hawkish and will raise rates. Rising rates are bad for speculative investments, which would include Bitcoin as well as altcoin prices. Now, if we get a lower CPI, the Fed realizes, hey, I can loosen it up a little bit. I can lower interest rates. Lower interest rates is good for speculative investments. If we look back at previous bull runs, when rates were going down, this was very good for Bitcoin and altcoins as well. So let's go over a few examples, which I'm going to read from the right. But June 2022, the CPI report was worse than expected. It was 9.1%. Bitcoin crashed during this period of time, or on this day, from 22,000 down to 17,000. If you look in November 2022, CPI reported lower than expected at 7.7%, and Bitcoin pumped from 16K to 18K. Gosh, those were the days when Bitcoin was low. Wouldn't it be great if we all went back and bought more? But I digress. In July 2023, the CPI report was better than expected at 3%, and Bitcoin rallied from 30,000 to 31,500. Again, these are all on single day. So there's a huge, huge effect that the CPI can have. So you can either make a choice of to be in the market or out of the market on the day that the CPI reports, based upon whether or not you want to risk how it's going to come out. Or if you feel like you got a crystal ball and you know what the CPI is going to be, then you want to make a bet on what the price of Bitcoin and altcoins is going to be on that day. And a bonus item, the Fed doesn't pay that much attention to the consumer price index. They have a different measure that doesn't get anywhere near the amount of headlines the CPI does. It's called PCE. Personal consumption expenditures is what that stands for, and generally reports lower than the CPI. One major difference is that the shelter portion of the PCE is substantially lower than the consumer price index. So only 15% of the PCE is shelter. The other thing that the PCE tracks that the CPI doesn't is government expenditures and insurance expenditures. So there are definitely a couple of key changes, a couple of key differences, I should say, than the CPI. And this is what the Fed, when they say their goal is 2%, they're not talking about the CPI. They're talking about the PCE. So now you know, CPI isn't just an inflation number. It moves crypto markets, dictates Fed policy, and directly impacts your portfolio. But what do you think? Does CPI accurately reflect what inflation actually is in this country? Tell me what you think. Drop it in a comment below. And if you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss another update on the economy, markets, crypto, and tech. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. The General is out. Have a good day.